Hello, welcome. Thank you so much for listening. We have a great show here planned for you today. I think I say that every time. I think if I said the show wasn't great, I probably shouldn't be doing this podcast. So I try to come out with the great stuff for you. So today we're chatting about metabolic diseases and your ketogenic diet, going beyond the how-to and understanding the why behind why you're doing the ketogenic diet, why this is important to you, why you're eating low carb, why you're waking up and listening to this podcast, like asking yourself why. Super important. So when tough times come, you can properly prepare for that and really have your goals set. If you're looking to understand and embrace what keto can do for your body, this is your episode. If you have a friend that you're like, hey, I think you should try keto, and they're like, man, I don't know, it's like too much work or whatever, this might be a good episode to share with them. And if you got this episode from a friend, you know that they love you so much and they want what's best for you and they think the ketogenic diet might be it. We're also talking about insulin resistance, obesity, and the vicious cycle. Our guest today is Dr. David Harper, who's a true gem, and I'm so thrilled that he's on the show today sharing his brilliance, kind heart, and inspiring story. So let's get to it. Hey, I'm Leanne Vogel, and you're listening to the Keto Diet Podcast. I've put together a free 21-page guide on achieving weight loss on your keto diet if nothing is working, as a little thank you for being here today. Grab your free guide at ketoforwomen.com to get the steps you need to overcome the hurdles standing in your way.
Hello, Leanne Vogel, and hello, listeners to the Keto Diet Podcast. My name is Dave Harper, and it's a pleasure to be here on the Keto Diet Podcast. Thank you, Leanne, for inviting me onto your show and to speak to your audience. Really exciting for me, especially since we both have books coming out. I had a book just released a few weeks ago called Bio Diet that I'd like to talk to you about a little bit. And I understand that you have a diet book coming out called Keto for Women on June 18th. Very excited about that, and I must say that's a much needed addition to the keto world, is a book specifically for women that are interested in adopting a ketogenic diet. I also want to thank you, Leanne, for your cookbook. We use that almost every day. My wife and co-author Dale Drury and I, especially the bread recipe. I think I probably use that almost weekly. I think it's on page 366 of your book. I really enjoyed that, and I also want to say that just a thanks to you for pointing out a couple of things. One is that any kind of diet, there is no one-size-fits-all diet, and everybody has to find a diet that works for themselves, that they can maintain, that also maintains their health. And this involves two important things. One is to have complete nutrition in your diet, and the other that I think you mentioned on many of your shows is the importance of mindfulness. Very important to be aware of what we're eating, what's in our food, and not just sort of respond to hunger and buy whatever looks like it might taste good. Now, I'm a keto researcher. I actually I'm a professor of kinesiology at the University of the Fraser Valley here in British Columbia. By the way, I'm talking to you from Vancouver, and I think, Leanne, that was your home at one time, and I think you were originally from Montreal, and I'm heading there tomorrow as part of my book tour. So we have a lot in common there too. And I'm a visiting scientist at the BC Cancer Research Centre, which is one of the leading cancer research centers in the world. And I work in the Terry Fox lab with Dr. Gerald Crystal, who's one of the leading he does the immunohistochemistry of cancer, and especially the innate immune system. And I think when I've listened to other people on podcasts and so on, they tend to begin with their own personal journey, what brought them to a ketogenic diet. And I think I'd like to start there. It was, about 10 years ago now, I was doing a radio show. I was a co-host of a radio show called Think for Yourself. And this is a show about critical reasoning and about healthy skepticism. And we were on for a number of years, a weekly show, and we wanted to do one show on weight loss and what was more effective for weight loss. Is it diet or is it exercise? And because I was a kinesiology prof and still am, I took the exercise side, and we had a guest, Dr. Richard Mathias, who is a physician and also a professor of public health at the University of British Columbia here in Vancouver. And he took the side of diet. And we were having a discussion about what caused obesity and how it was best addressed. And he said, "Well, Dave, what do you think causes obesity?" And I gave what I thought was, the conventional wisdom at the time that I believed and that I taught to my students. And that was that obesity is, a multifactorial problem that stems from psychosocial factors and metabolic factors and genetic factors. And I talked for about 30 seconds, and Dr. Matthias was very patient with me. And when I finished talking, he stopped me and he said, "Dave, it's much simpler. It's a physiological response to excess carbohydrate in the diet." And boy, if I've ever had an aha moment, that was it, because you have to understand, I've been teaching anatomy and physiology and pathology for more than 30 years, even at that time. I'm very aware of how the human body works. And frankly, it just crystallized in my mind at that time. And I thought, wow, could it really be that simple? And to go back, to answer the question about what's better, exercise or diet, we know now that it's really kind of an 80-20 rule, that weight loss and maintaining a healthy weight is about 80% to do with your diet and about 20% to do with exercise. And we have a few sort of catchphrases we use for that. One is that you lose weight in the kitchen and you get fit in the gym. And the other one that I kind of like too is you can't outrun your fork. So yes, diet is very important. In fact, the journal Lancet in 2017, it was a report on the global burden of chronic disease, and they concluded after their studies that, in fact, the biggest lifestyle contributor to chronic disease was, in fact, diet, and that diet was more important than even smoking, than alcohol, than sedentary behavior or lack of exercise, all of those combined. So that's one of the things we've learned in nutrition science is that the real importance of diet to maintain your weight. And then what I research are the effects of ketogenic diets to prevent and even treat chronic disease. And when I talk about chronic disease, I'm talking about conditions like cancer, cardiovascular disease, diabetes, and even Alzheimer's. These are all now considered to be metabolic disorders. And so what I've done in our book, Bio Diet, it's all one word, is kind of divided that book in half. And there's some great books on ketogenic diets. Leanne has some fantastic recipe and cookbooks, but also how-to books. But what I thought I could lend to the discussion was drawing on my background as a teacher and talking about not just the how-to for a ketogenic diet, but I think what's really additionally important, which is why. So my value proposition, if you like, is that if people understand why ketogenic diets are effective in weight loss and why they're effective in preventing and treating chronic disease in terms of their own body function, then I think people are going to be able to adopt and sustain ketogenic diets with more success. So I'd like to talk more about the why today. I'll talk a little bit about some of the factors that I contribute to in terms of the how, a few little nuances in terms of adopting and sustaining a ketogenic diet, some of which is mindfulness and the psychological aspect as well. So I am, my background is in science. I have a PhD. I'm not a physician. I want to emphasize that. If you see doctor in front of my name, it's because I have a PhD. I'm not a physician. But I've been researching nutrition science, again, for about 10 years. I kind of turned my research towards nutrition science when I realized that the paradigm we have for what constitutes a healthy diet, and this is the paradigm or model that's presented to us by our policymakers, our governments, is probably not only not the best for us in terms of our health and longevity, but may in fact be contributing to a lot of the chronic disease we see today. And so I'm going to try and explain some of that in the same way that my wife Dale and I have done in our book, which is, I think, what we've tried to do is make the book as engaging and even entertaining as possible, and to tone down the depth of the science so that it's approachable and that anybody really can have a read of the first 100 or so pages. And if they do, they're going to have a really good understanding of how diet contributes to chronic disease and how adopting a ketogenic diet has the potential to reverse that in quite sudden and profound ways too.
I deal with anxiety. Yep. And I'm not ashamed to share this either. When plans go sideways or I'm unsure of something or there's just too much on my to-do list, I completely spiral. Diet helps. Quality sleep helps. Setting clear boundaries helps, but when the anxiety just starts to creep in, there are very few things that will help in the moment. You know, the whole chest tightening, air gasping kind of moments. My moment solution is CBD oil, and I've tried a lot of brands over the years to find the CBD oil that delivers the quickest, cleanest, and most effective solution, and that's Eaton Hemp. Their unfiltered USDA certified organic full spectrum CBD oil is minimally processed and infused in their own hemp seed oil, giving you the full entourage effect, maximum absorption, potency, and effectiveness. Not only does Eaton Hemp provide one of the cleanest CBD products on the market, but they pride themselves on transparency. Eaton Hemp is farmer-owned and strongly believes in whole plant nutrition. That's why they leave the CBD unfiltered so all the elements of the hemp plant can work in unison. Eaton Hemp is so confident in the results their CBD will give you that they offer a full 30-day money-back guarantee. So if you aren't satisfied with their product, they'll refund you with no questions asked. When you go to eatonhemp.com/keto diet, you will save 25% with the code Keto Diet, and you'll be given the 30-day money-back guarantee. Use the code Keto Diet at eatonhemp.com/keto diet and decide for yourself if this is your moment solution for the anxiety you face.
So I'm going to start with the model I have, and it's a bit of a takeoff on George Bush too. If you remember, he made a reference to the axis of evil. Well, I talk about the axis of illness in biodiet, and for me, the axis of illness, if you picture a triangle with 3 points on it, at the top we'd have insulin resistance. And on one other corner, we'd have obesity, and the third axis of the triangle would be inflammation. So again, those three things, insulin resistance, obesity, and inflammation, I think are at the root cause of chronic disease. And when I talk about chronic disease, again, that's cardiovascular disease, cancer, diabetes, and Alzheimer's, mostly what we consider to be metabolic diseases. So if you consider those three things, about 70% of all chronic disease is caused by or aggravated by those three things: insulin resistance, obesity, and inflammation. And I think if you talk to just about any physician or researcher that's researching the cause or treatment of chronic disease, they would agree that if we can do something about obesity, insulin resistance, and inflammation, we could really address chronic disease in a significant way. So that was my starting point. And so if you take that model, again, insulin resistance, obesity, and inflammation, they all make each other worse. It's kind of a vicious cycle. So once you become insulin resistant, you tend to be more obese. And once you're more obese, you tend to become more insulin resistant. Obesity relates to inflammation, and inflammation tends to cause more obesity. Insulin resistance causes inflammation, and inflammation aggravates insulin resistance. So they all make each other worse. So once you start heading down that road of insulin resistance, obesity, and inflammation, it just kind of keeps getting worse and worse and worse until you end up being diagnosed with one or more of these chronic diseases. This is particularly important for women too, by the way. Obesity for women correlates with much higher rates of cardiovascular disease, and then diabetes as well is more prominent. The Alzheimer's as a result of diabetes, because you're twice as likely to have Alzheimer's if you're diabetic type 2. If you're a woman, it's even more common. So adding carbohydrate to this, which we've been recommending for 40 years, and I want to say to your listeners, and also I've apologized in my book to my students that I taught for 30 years or so. And I have to apologize because I taught the traditional food guide, which would be a high carbohydrate, low fat, very low saturated fat diet. I really thought that was the best diet for health and to prevent chronic disease. Since I adopted a ketogenic diet about, it's almost 7 or 8 years ago now, I lost 27 pounds of body fat quite quickly. All of my biomarkers improved quite dramatically. I never had needed any medication, and I was never, ill or had any need of any medication or treatment for any chronic disease. But I was putting weight on, and as you put weight on, your blood sugar creeps up and your blood pressure creeps up. So I kind of saw that coming and thought I had to do something. And after meeting Dr. Matthias, and he sort of took me down the rabbit hole, I researched that traditional Western diet, we call it, or the standard Western diet. I looked for the evidence that supported saturated fat causing cardiovascular disease and leading to obesity. And I'm a trained scientist, and I looked very hard at all the literature, and it's just not there. In fact, there's no robust evidence to suggest that saturated fat, for example, contributes to cardiovascular disease. In fact, some saturated fats from dairy, for instance, are actually cardioprotective. And, I think we were taken down the wrong path by a number of sort of well-meaning but misguided scientists back in the 50s and 60s that just got hooked on the notion that saturated fat was behind cardiovascular disease, and because fat is more energy dense than proteins or carbohydrates, that a high-fat diet would also cause people to become obese and so on. Now, when we actually look at the science behind this, we don't, as I mentioned, we don't see that at all. In fact, what we see is a central role for insulin. Now, most of you are probably aware of the fact that insulin is required. It's secreted by your pancreas, and it's required to help some of our cells, especially muscle cells and liver cells, absorb glucose from the blood. Glucose is blood sugar, and when you eat carbohydrates, those carbohydrates, whether they're simple sugars or more complex sugars like complex carbohydrates like starch, they're all converted eventually into to glucose, which we call blood sugar. And when your blood sugar rises, your pancreas will secrete increasing amounts of insulin. And the insulin then is a signal to these cells to uptake the glucose from the blood, to absorb it from the blood into the cells, where it can be either stored or used for fuel, depending on what your energy state is at the time. Now, when blood sugar levels are normal and insulin levels are normal, we don't have any problems that would contribute to chronic disease. However, because since the first dietary guidelines for Americans was released in 1980, which suggested that we should have a high carbohydrate diet, Americans did what they were told. They ate a high carbohydrate diet. The typical standard Western diet is about 65% of calories from carbohydrate. About half of those calories are from highly processed foods, and about a quarter of those calories are from sugar in one form or another. And all of that has contributed to basically an epidemic increase in both overweight and obesity, to the point where today 75% of adult Americans, that's 18 years or older, are now overweight or obese. It's very sad. And of course, again, looking back at the axis of illness, obesity and insulin resistance and inflammation are going to lead to a lot of chronic disease. So it's no wonder we've had these epidemic increases in chronic disease, in particular diabetes. If you look at the rate of increase of obesity, what you see in terms of diabetes is the same pattern following about 10 years later. In other words, it seems that on average it takes about 10 years of eating a high carbohydrate diet as an adult before you start seeing your blood sugar creep up and your insulin resistance creep up. And then, as we mentioned, those make each other worse. So right now, about half of Americans are diabetic or pre-diabetic, and those that are pre-diabetic, about half of them will become diabetic. And people have suggested, when they crunch the numbers, that by 2030, if we look at diabetes alone, by 2030, it will cost the United States about $800 billion a year just to treat diabetes. And to put that in perspective, $800 billion is about what the U.S.'s Pentagon spends annually this year. So that's the defense budget every year just treating diabetes. And really, as a result, I think, of the chronic overconsumption of carbohydrate. So if we look at insulin, you can do these experiments with mice where you give them the same amount of food over the same period of time. They eat the same amount, but you give some of the mice excessive insulin. So we call that hyperinsulinemia. insulinemia, which means too much insulin in the blood. What happens over a period of about 8 months is that the mice that were given extra insulin actually become very obese, about twice the size of the other mice. Again, the same amount of food over the same period of time. So what this tells us is that not only does insulin help us to absorb glucose from the blood, but it's also very important in turning that glucose into fat. So when your glucose levels are normal, you tend not to put on body fat. But when your glucose levels are high and your insulin levels therefore are high, you tend to put on body fat. And this has been demonstrated in humans as well. In fact, you could look at the last 30 or 40 years of dietary guidelines as a massive experiment on 300 to 400 million North Americans to see what would happen if we put everybody on a high-carb diet. And, I'd argue the results are in. Again, 3/4 of the population overweight or obese and half the population diabetic or pre-diabetic. That's a pretty sad set of circumstances. Now, the really great news is that we have very robust science to support this as well. If you adopt a ketogenic diet, what you're doing essentially, the simplest way to describe it, is taking as much carbohydrate out of your diet as possible. So, you're taking the sugar and the starch and so on out of your diet. Well, these three factors of the axis of illness, insulin resistance, obesity, and inflammation, they resolve very quickly. In fact, we see about a 75% improvement in insulin sensitivity, which is the opposite of insulin resistance, within about 4 weeks, typically after adopting a ketogenic diet. So, this recent really robust research done by, great researchers at the leading institutions globally, it's really changing the game now. And so much so that, Australia and then New Zealand and now the United States diabetes societies are now recognizing low-carbon ketogenic diets as effective therapeutics for chronic disease. So if you look at some of the other conditions, I've talked quite a bit about diabetes. Ketogenic diets have been used for over 100 years to treat epilepsy, which is quite interesting because diabetes, cardiovascular disease, cancer, and so on, these are considered to be metabolic diseases. They're diseases of the energetic systems of the body. Epilepsy is really a neurological condition that affects the brain. And it's really interesting to look at. One of the questions I have is why ketogenic diets are so effective at treating both metabolic and neurological conditions. And so there's really good evidence that ketogenic diets are effective in preventing and treating cardiovascular disease. This would be heart attacks and strokes and high blood pressure, for epilepsy, as I mentioned, and for diabetes, as I mentioned, and also weight loss. I think it's pretty conclusive now that the best way to lose body fat and keep it off is to sustain a ketogenic diet. There's also really interesting emerging evidence to support the therapeutic use of ketogenic diets for polycystic ovarian syndrome, which is the leading cause of infertility in women. Very important because it seems like PCOS, as it's called, is actually a disease of insulin resistance. So again, if the high-carb diet is causing insulin resistance, well, that can lead to PCOS. It can also lead to acne and even cancer.
Maybe you've heard of all the amazing things that apple cider vinegar can do for you. If you have not, let's review. It can balance healthy blood sugar, banish cravings, and encourage fat loss. It can improve protein absorption and digestion by helping you break down animal protein so you can use those nutrients more effectively. It can help you stabilize healthy blood sugar, which helps improve energy and mood. An aid in the healthful aging process, has been shown to lower morning glucose, fasting glucose, and help stabilize blood sugar by increasing the ability of our muscles to take up sugar from our blood. Okay, so you could just go to your pantry and chug some apple cider vinegar. No, don't do it. It'll burn your esophagus. So you always have to mix it with water. And here's the thing. I don't know about you, but when I have a liquid supplement, I will 9 times out of 10 forget to take the stuff. And that's why I love Paleo Valley's apple cider vinegar complex, because not only does it have apple cider vinegar, but it also has turmeric, ginger, cinnamon, lemon, all organic ingredients to further support all the benefits of apple cider vinegar and more. If you are encouraged to take the stuff and you just don't think that you'll drink the liquid, you can head on over to paleovalley.com. and load up on a couple of bottles of apple cider vinegar complex and whatever else that catches your eyes. I personally love the superfood bars. They're just amazing. Enter the code KETO at checkout to receive 15% off your first order. Again, that's paleovalley.com and use the code KETO at checkout for 15% off your first order.
So I'll talk a little bit about cancer now. This is my area of research. And I'm part of an international group because some of us are here in Vancouver. The rest most of the study is being done Jeff Volek's lab. Jeff is at the Ohio State University, and we've teamed up. We at the BC Cancer Research Center have teamed up with Jeff for a 3-year study to look at the therapeutic benefits of ketogenic diets for women with metastatic breast cancer. And before I go on, I just want to say that I grew up. My mother was diagnosed with metastatic breast cancer when I was just a boy, 5 years old, and she struggled with that until she died just before I turned 10 years old. So it's something very close to my heart. So to be able to contribute to something that might help women with breast cancer is very rewarding for me. So I guess what the simple model for how ketogenic diets might help with cancer is that cancer cells, for the most part, don't have the same metabolic flexibility as other body cells. And when I say that, what I mean is other body cells can use different types of fuel for their energy needs. They can use proteins, fats, and carbohydrates, glucose. However, cancer cells, it's this shift in metabolism. Cancer cells are driven towards cell division. That's why they grow uncontrollably. And there's an effect called the Warburg effect, or Warburg effect, which is that cancer cells will, because they can't use fats and proteins very well for fuel, they're dependent on glucose, so they'll concentrate glucose 100 to 200 times that of normal cells. Now think about that. Your cancer cells are there growing, and they're dependent on carbohydrate, on glucose, almost exclusively for their energy needs, and so they're concentrating at high rates. So on a high carbohydrate diet, you're really supplying all of the fuel that these cancer cells need to grow. And what's more is that because your blood sugar levels are high on a high carbohydrate diet, and as we've discussed, your insulin levels are also chronically high on a high carbohydrate diet. Insulin is also a growth factor. It's a very powerful growth factor. So it stimulates cell growth and division. And if you fold that into the mix, here we have these cancer cells in an optimal environment for growth. They have all of the glucose they need and more, and they have these growth factors, which are kind of like fertilizer. So the basic principle behind which a ketogenic diet works, without getting too sciencey on you, is that we're removing excess carbohydrate and we're limiting the amount of insulin. And what that does is kind of tip the balance in favor of your immune system. So your immune system will have a better chance at identifying and destroying those cancer cells, which is one of the important roles of your immune system. So even when we are treated with various therapies, ultimately it's our immune system that has to win the day. And one of the things that we've discovered in a very small sample, they're not controlled studies, but just preliminary pilot studies have indicated that one of the effects of a ketogenic diet is a heightened immune response. So we're seeing a more effective immune system in people that are keto adapted than those that aren't. And that may also help to tip that balance in favor of your immune system winning the day. So it's really hard to prove that a ketogenic diet would prevent something like cancer, because you'd have to have these massive controlled studies for decades with thousands of people, and it would just be cost prohibitive. So what we have to show is, as best we can, is that the mechanisms by which ketogenic diets work have some anti-cancer properties to them, and maybe immune-enhancing properties. So early days still. They were only in the middle of this 3-year study, so we don't have any final results, but I would say that the preliminary results are very promising. I would also add that ketogenic diets are not a replacement for your standard of care. You should always take the advice of your physician, your oncologist, if you have cancer. But you should discuss the possibility of using a ketogenic diet as an adjunct therapy, so along with the standard of care, whatever that might be. That's our hope. And hopefully in a couple of years, we'll have some more conclusive results. There are some other studies that are working on something called GBM, glioblastoma multiforme, and even pancreatic cancer. All of those have some promise, but still early days, and we can't make any broad conclusions. The other interesting thing about ketogenic diets in terms of a therapeutic is they may be beneficial for preventing and treating Alzheimer's disease. Alzheimer's has been considered by Suzanne de la Monte at Brown University. She calls it type 3 diabetes. Essentially, it's insulin resistance of the brain. So the brain doesn't need insulin to get glucose in, but it does need insulin internally within those nerve cells to have the nerves working properly. So I kind of like to think this, I use sort of a car analogy. Some cells, the insulin is a key to get you, to unlock the door, to get you inside. In the brain cells, you can get in okay, but you still need that key to turn the motor over to get the fuel running properly to the engine. When I was in school back, last century, we always learned that the brain could only ever use glucose as a fuel. And there's still some myth out there about, you need 150 grams of carbohydrate every day because that's what your brain needs. Well, your liver can make that just fine. And I know Leanne's talked about that on some of her other shows through a process called gluconeogenesis, or making new glucose from non-glucose sources. So this would be your glycerol, lactic acid, and in particular proteins. So we can make our own. And when we burn fat on a ketogenic diet, we produce these ketones, the most important of which is beta-hydroxybutyrate, or BHB. And this is actually a preferred fuel for the brain. The brain will take it doesn't need to draw the fuel in as it does with glucose. It actually has to expend energy to get the glucose in the cells. The glucose simply works down its concentration gradient and enters the brain cells passively. And when it's metabolized within those brain cells, much less oxidative stress on those brain cells, which is beneficial, and also much less inflammation. Alzheimer's disease is, no question, an inflammatory disease of the brain, and ketogenic diets are particularly anti-inflammatory, and we know now that they have positive effects on the brain. And some work by my friend and colleague Stephen Cunnane at the University of Sherbrooke has shown that exogenous ketones, so let's say MCT oil, which I know Leanne's discussed on previous shows, the medium-chain triglyceride oil, especially the C8 version, is converted completely. You take it exogenously, means you take it, you eat it, so it's in the form of a liquid oil or a powder. And those ketones, that MCT oil is converted 100% if it's C8 into ketones within the liver, and then that can circulate, and it's a really powerful signaling molecule. And as I said, the brain preferentially uses it at lower cost. So it's kind of like shifting your brain from like a gas-powered brain to an electric brain. So you're taking all that fuel out of there that has all kinds of wastes and hazardous sort of waste and carbon and so on that it's producing in the exhaust, and you're switching it to a cleaner burning, more like an electric car, cleaner burning fuel. And what Dr. Cunnane has found was just reported in the media a week or so ago, is really profound improvements in the cognitive function of Alzheimer's disease patients who are taking just 30 grams a day of MCT oil. That's 2 tablespoons a day of MCT oil. Really profoundly improved brain function, cognitive function. And we also expect that those on a ketogenic diet have some protection from Alzheimer's disease down the road.
I really hope you're enjoying today's episode. I'd love to see where you're listening from. You can snap a pic and tag me at Leanne Vogel, or leave a review for the show on your favorite podcast player. It helps me out tremendously. Okay, back to the good stuff.
So there's just a couple of chronic diseases that we're kind of looking at. I've counseled hundreds of people over the years on ketogenic diets, and I thought I'd just quickly talk about some of the questions that tend to pop up. Can you be on a ketogenic diet if you're a vegetarian, for example? Yes, you can. It's actually quite easy as a vegetarian. You can even do it as a vegan. It's a little trickier there. Will I get sufficient nutrition on a ketogenic diet? Absolutely. A well-formulated ketogenic diet, which the bio diet is a well-formulated ketogenic diet, these provide, in fact, more nutrition than the standard Western diet because you're taking out all those empty calories that are sugar and starch, and you're replacing them with healthy fats and other nutrient dense foods. Is it sustainable? Ketogenic diets are absolutely sustainable. My wife and I have been on a ketogenic diet for more than 7 years. I know people that are more than 10 years. There is a period of transition where you have a metabolic change where you need some help from a nutritional counselor. But once you've adapted, I call it bioadapted, to a ketogenic diet, you'll find that those cravings for sugar and things like bread and rice, they just go away because you have this really satisfying thing that you're adding to your diet, which is called fat. And fat, healthy fats, whether they're saturated or not, are really, really satisfying. That's where all the flavor is in food. So you kind of replace the need for sugars and sweet things with more of an interest in savory things. So those are just a couple of questions that come up a lot. So I'll just talk, to finish up, I'll just talk a little bit about our book, Bio Diet. And if you're interested in having a look at the book, our website is biodiet.org. And both Dale and I have our emails there. It's dale@biodiet.org or david@biodiet.org. So if you happen to pick up the book, we'd love to hear what you think of it. So what we've done there in the how-to is to break the conversion from sugar burning to fat burning into five steps. And the first step, and you know what, this is very, very much like what Leanne's done as well. Leanne really knows what she's talking about here. She's got a lot of experience as well. And so what I suggest, first of all, is talk to your physician, especially if you have a chronic disease, especially if you're taking medication. It's very important, especially during this adaptation phase, because you might need what we call concomitant reduction of the medications that you're taking for high blood pressure or high blood sugar, and only your physician can determine what's appropriate for you. So start by talking to your physician. Then you can talk about the sorts of measurements that you can take, both physical measurements and measurements of the lipids in your blood and blood pressure and so on. I call this step bioassessment. And then what I've added to help people avoid the keto flu, which I'm sure many of the listeners know about or have experienced, is I have a next stage is called biopreparation. And what I ask people to do is to ease into a ketogenic diet to bioadaptation by first reducing sugar, increasing your water intake, adding MCT oil, which introduces your body to these ketones that it's probably not that familiar with, slowly over a period of a week or two, before you go sort of hardcore, cut the carbs down around 20 milligrams a day, which is required for most people to bioadapt. In other words, to change from sugar burning to fat burning. And I like to think of this kind of like if you've ever learned to play guitar, you know that over a period of a few weeks when you're practicing guitar, you'll get these calluses on your fingertips. And those calluses are protein, keratin that's building up. The cells are responding to the stimulus by changing, and they get thickened calluses. Well, the same kind of thing happens when you bioadapt. That is, your body's probably not that familiar with the ketones or fat burning, and it takes it a little while to activate the genes and activate the proteins that become the enzymes in those metabolic pathways that allow you to burn fats instead of sugars. And during that process, there's going to be some unfamiliar things going on in your body, and so you'll sense some changes. And some people call this, the dizziness and the sort of nausea and sleep and brain fog and so on. They call it the keto flu, and I experienced this myself because I went cold turkey when I bioadapted. But you can avoid that with a couple of easy steps. One, I think, is to introduce it slowly. The second is to make sure that you have the salts right. For example, salts being sodium, potassium, calcium, and especially magnesium. All of this is discussed in BioDiet. And that will eventually take you to a place of constant nutritional ketosis. In other words, you're constantly fat burning, and you're producing these beneficial ketones, especially BHB, which your brain loves and your heart loves and even your muscles love. And that actually, it turns out, has a rejuvenating effect. So I call the step after the adaptation phase biorejuvenation, because in terms of your biomarkers, not your chronological age, but your physiological age, you actually get younger. The inflammation is reduced, and we even have a term called inflammaging. Inflammation really contributes to the aging process. So by preventing that inflammation, you're actually slowing or even reversing to some degree the aging process. When I see reversing, there is actually some, we call it epigenetic evidence that there's changes in telomere length and so on. These are little kind of like the plastic things at your end of your laces that are at the end of chromosomes, and they tend to shorten as you age. It turns out that the BHB has the effect of actually reversing some of that. These are very preliminary studies, of course. But your skin improves, you lose body fat, people say you look great, you feel great, the brain fog goes away, and sometimes this change is very, very sudden. My friends like to call it the Harper high, where they'll just wake up one day during this adaptation phase and just feel fantastic. And I can tell you from my own personal experience counseling people that some people lose more weight than others, some people respond better than others. Ketogenic diets are not for everybody, so it's important that there are some conditions for which you shouldn't be on a ketogenic diet. But for those that can benefit, and my rough estimate is that's about 7 out of 8 people can benefit after the 12-week intervention, which is the sort of minimum amount of time you need to really make those changes in your body, but also in your head, so that you have new habits that are very positive, and you've reinforced the importance of sustaining the ketogenic diet. 100% of the people I've counseled after the 12 weeks say they feel great. No matter what happens, they feel great. And you know, what's wrong with that? Nothing, of course, right? It's a fantastic way to end. So I really wanted to thank Leanne for the opportunity to talk about our book, BioDiet. I'm going out on tour in Canada, and then I'll be doing a lot of podcasts and radio in the United States over the next few months and years. I'll be at a few conferences and giving local presentations. I also want to, as a fellow author, really congratulate Leanne on her new book, which is the Keto for Women book, which comes out June 18th. I think this is being recorded a couple weeks before that. But having written a book, it's a real challenge to write a book. It's finding the time to do it and taking the care to make sure it's good. And judging by Leanne's previous books, I just know this one's going to be super popular and very, very important for women that are on the ketogenic journey. So thanks again. You can find more information and even read part of the book on our website, biodiet.org. And please have a look for the book. It's available on all your usual online book retailers as well as in stores now. And if you do pick up a copy, please get in touch with us through the website and let us know what you think. And to wish you goodbye, I wish you all health and happiness, and I hope to see as many of you in person in the future as I can. Thank you very much.
I hope you enjoyed today's episode. I can't wait to see you back here next Tuesday for another one. Have a good week. Bye. Thanks for listening to the Keto Diet Podcast. Join us again in a couple of days to discover more Keto for Women secrets for your fat-fueled life. Music for the Keto Diet Podcast provided by Yechi. Follow Jacob on Instagram at Yechi_official and on Spotify as Yechi. That's YECHI. The Keto Diet Podcast, including show notes and links, provides information in respect to healthy living, recipes, nutrition, and diet, and is intended for informational purposes only. The information provided is not a substitute for medical advice, diagnosis, or treatment, nor is it to be construed as such. We cannot guarantee that the information provided on the Keto Diet Podcast reflects the most up-to-date medical research. Information is provided without any representations or warranties of any kind. Please consult a qualified physician for medical medical advice, and always seek the advice of a qualified healthcare provider with any questions you may have regarding your health and nutrition program.